My husband watched as his friends entered into me, a true infidelity story. I've kept this secret for so long, but the memory of what occurred that night still lingers, refusing to fade. Perhaps you'll understand when I explain, or maybe you'll think I'm out of my mind, but I need to let it out because it's been tearing me apart inside. My husband always had unwavering faith in his friend, perhaps too much, and that trust nearly cost me everything. It wasn't supposed to happen. At least, that's what I'd kept telling myself, but that night, something felt different. The atmosphere was electric, like I was teetering on the brink of something monumental, something that could change or ruin everything. It was never meant to go beyond control, but when you're caught in the moment, it's easy to lose sight of what you should do. That night, I almost lost my way. It began on a seemingly ordinary evening, nothing out of the ordinary. My husband, Thomas, had invited his friend Harold over for dinner. I've known Harold for years. He's been a part of our lives since Thomas and I first got together. He's the kind of person who can enter a room and instantly put everyone at ease. Nevertheless, deep down, I always harbored an inexplicable feeling about him. Nevertheless, it pains me to say the words. There was something in the way he looked at me that I could never quite ignore. It felt as though he saw me in a way no one else ever did. Still, I brushed it off. After all, he was just Thomas's friend. What harm could there be? That night, the three of us sat together, enjoying drinks. Thomas was his usual self, relaxed, cheerful, laughing, completely oblivious to the subtle shift unfolding around him. But I noticed it. It began with small gestures, a fleeting glance, a soft touch that lingered just a moment too long. Inaria is named for God. Harold had this habit of standing just a bit too close, laughing a touch too enthusiastically at my jokes, and it made me feel oddly special. It was like, for once, I wasn't invisible to him. I tried to shrug it off, but it wasn't simple. The tension between us had been building over the past few months, growing stronger with every moment that passed. Thomas remained unaware, busy pouring drinks and sharing stories, completely missing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Harold sat right beside me, his arm lightly brushing against mine as he reached for his glass. I couldn't dismiss it any longer. His touch felt different. It wasn't just a casual, friendly gesture. I turned to look at him, trying to decipher his expression. He met my gaze, and in that instant, everything changed. He didn't smile. It wasn't the usual friendly look I was used to. It was something more, almost as if he was challenging me to take the next step. The thought lingered. Crossing that line had never occurred to me before, but at present, it has been all I could think about. As Thomas went to the kitchen to fetch more snacks, Harold leaned in closer the moment he left the room. His warm breath brushed against my skin, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. In a low, smooth voice, he whispered in my ear, "You know you're more than just Thomas's wife to me. You always have been." I froze, questioning if I had heard him correctly. I wanted to pull away, to put a stop to it, but I couldn't move. His words seemed to have already taken root in my mind, echoing relentlessly like a broken record. My thoughts were a mess. I should have stopped him and told him to step back, but my body refused to obey my mind. I was battling an urge to act, an urge I knew I would regret. Before I could say a word, Thomas re-entered the room. Harold immediately pulled away, pretending as though nothing had occurred. He straightened up, cleared his throat, and carried on as if everything was normal, but I knew better. I sensed it in the atmosphere. The distance between us had shifted, and there was no returning to how things had been. Later that night, after Thomas had fallen asleep, I found myself wide awake. Restless, I tossed and turned as my thoughts spiraled out of control. Harold's voice echoed in my mind, his touch still warm on my skin, and the way he looked at me, like I was the only one who mattered, lingered far too vividly. I couldn't push it aside any longer. I knew something was bound to happen, but would I have the strength to stop it when the time came? Sleep eluded me. Every time I shut my eyes, his words played over and over. "You're more than just Thomas's wife to me." It was like a haunting melody I couldn't escape, no matter how desperately I tried. My mind raced through every possible outcome, questioning my desires, my boundaries, and even my own sense of self. My mind was a whirlpool of pain. Thomas, oblivious, lay beside me, his calm, steady breathing a testament to the life we had built together. It should have been reassuring, but instead it felt like a weight pressing down on me. How could I even entertain the thought of betraying him? Yet it wasn't as though I had sought this out. I never invited Harold's attention, but it was there, persistent and undeniable, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The more I dwelled on it, the more trapped I felt. Ignoring it, pretending it wasn't real, would only be deceiving myself. This wasn't nothing. The intensity of Harold's gaze wasn't accidental, and perhaps that was what unsettled me most of all. I wasn't sure if I could ever truly let it go. The next morning still felt ordinary. Too ordinary. Thomas prepared breakfast and Harold joined us for coffee, acting as though everything was perfectly fine. But I wasn't fooled. I could sense the shift, and I was certain Harold could feel it too. It was as if we were balancing on a tightrope, the tension between us almost tangible. This wasn't just in my imagination. I saw it in his eyes whenever Thomas wasn't around, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the faint, knowing smile that curled his lips. I tried to maintain my gait, to avoid being too close, but it was far from easy. The more I attempted to ignore him, the more it seemed like he was testing boundaries, pushing to see how far I'd let him go. I began to notice the subtle details, the casual brushes of his hand, the way he leaned in just a little too much during conversations. Every moment between us felt charged, as if we were both waiting for something inevitable to unfold. One afternoon, while Thomas was out running errands, Harold stopped by. I was tidying up the living room when he knocked, but instead of waiting for an invitation, he strolled in like he owned the place. It was a gesture so familiar, it left me feeling both at ease and strangely unsettled. "Hey," he said, his tone overly casual as he sank into the couch. "I was thinking maybe we could grab lunch sometime. Just the two of us." I froze, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. His words lingered, unspoken yet loud enough to echo in my thoughts. Was he trying to get closer, or was this just his way of being friendly? I couldn't tell. I could have easily brushed it off and made an excuse about being busy, but for some reason, I didn't. Rather, I found myself nodding, almost without thinking. "Sure, that sounds nice." It was out of character for me. I never encouraged anything like this. I was faithful. I loved Thomas. But the way Harold gazed at me made me doubt everything, and that seemingly harmless invitation felt like a door opening. I wasn't sure if I should step through, yet I couldn't resist being drawn to it. When our hands reached for something together, it felt like an unspoken invitation. I struggled to shift my focus, to silence the desire that was tightening its grip on me, but resisting only seemed to fuel it further. A part of me wanted to back off because I knew I was on the verge of losing my balance. A part of me that was yearning for something more told me that I was already too far gone, even if I tried to remind myself that I had everything to lose. How much would it hurt to take one more step? The following day, Harold contacted me with a message. Lunch wasn't enough for him anymore. He wanted something deeper, He wanted to spend time with just me. I froze, unsure of how to reply. I wanted to say no, but my fingers lingered over the screen as if they had their own intentions. My heart pounded, and my mind swirled with questions. Was this the turning point? Was this where everything shifted, as if time had stopped for a second? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the words on my phone. I think we should get away, just the two of us. We both feel it, don't we? I was torn inside. I didn't know how to react. A part of me wanted to shout, erase the message, and cut all ties with him forever. There was another part of me that wanted to say yes, the part that I couldn't control. It was the joy of doing something that was prohibited, the thrill of the unknown. I placed my phone down, got up, and began pacing the room. I had a jumbled mind. Thomas would be home soon, completely unaware of what was unfolding. He wouldn't comprehend the emotions I was grappling with. How could I possibly articulate this to him? How could I explain how Harold awakened something in me that Thomas no longer could? The thought filled me with guilt, but I couldn't suppress it. My eyes drifted back to the phone. The message lingered there, innocuous in appearance, yet it felt like Harold had detonated a bomb in my life, leaving me to manage the aftermath. Ignoring it seemed impossible. It drew me in like a magnet. I considered replying, thought about telling him it was wrong, that I couldn't go through with this, but I couldn't muster the courage to type those words. In the end, I sent nothing. Instead, I stumbled through the rest of my day in a haze, burdened by the weight of what had just occurred. That evening, Thomas and I had dinner together as usual. He didn't seem to notice anything different about me. He was his cheerful self, as usual, cracking jokes about his day at work and asking about mine. But my mind was elsewhere, fixated on Harold's message. Every time I glanced at Thomas, I felt the weight of a secret pressing down on me, suffocating me with guilt. The risky aspect was the concept of it, the idea of what may occur, even if I wasn't actually doing anything yet. I was becoming disoriented there. The following day, Harold called. His voice was steady, almost unnervingly calm. He asked if I was available for lunch, just the two of us. I froze, unsure how to reply. It felt as though the walls were closing in, like I was teetering on a tightrope, and the next step could shatter everything. Before he could say anything else, I hung up. My heart pounded in my chest. Was I really considering this? Was I prepared to jeopardize everything for a fleeting moment of something I wasn't even sure I wanted? That phone call consumed my thoughts. Harold's voice lingered in my mind like a gentle whisper, urging me to make a decision. I felt torn. Part of me screamed to stop, to not let this go any further. Yet, a darker, more impulsive side whispered that I might regret not taking the chance, that this could be my opportunity to feel alive again, to experience something I hadn't felt in so long time. I woke up the next morning still feeling as though everything was on my chest. In the other room, I could hear Thomas getting ready for work. He had a carefree attitude at all and was humming a tune. I was envious of him at the time. He was so sure of himself and his role in my life, but I was no longer certain of mine. I had no certainty about anything. I took out my phone to look at Harold's message once again. He wrote, "We both know there's something here." My heart was racing. It was unbelievable to me that I was even thinking about this. Was betraying my husband truly on my mind? In addition to the overpowering shame, there was also this terrible fascination. How would it feel? Would that be a permanent change? Would I be able to follow through at all? Since I was unable to decide for myself, I did the one thing I never would have imagined doing. Let's meet today, but no funny business, just lunch. I wrote Harold back. Before I could stop myself, I sent the message. My stomach fell the moment I did. What had I just done? There wasn't even time for me to consider it further. Thomas called out to me from the other room, asking whether I had seen his keys. Turning back to reality, I felt a pang of guilt, simply because I had been sneaking around. I handed him his keys, putting on a facade that everything was perfectly fine, though inside I was a wreck. Around midday, I found myself standing outside a quaint little cafe, the one Harold and I used to frequent when we were younger, back before life became so tangled. He called me in. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread wafted through the air, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I had. I wasn't here for a casual lunch. I was here for something entirely different. Harold approached me, a relaxed smile playing on his lips. His jeans hugged him just right, and his shirt fit perfectly. He looked incredible. Too incredible. Too tempting. A part of me almost wished I could back out, but I didn't. "Hey," he greeted me, his voice as smooth as ever, though there was something new about it. It carried a weight, a sense of understanding in his gaze. He wasn't just here for lunch, either. He wanted something more. I responded, attempting to sound casual, though my heart was pounding in my chest. We took a seat outside at a table. It was not warm, even though the sun was blazing. The air was really cooler than I had remembered. Perhaps it was because I understood the stakes. Perhaps it was because I was now coming to the realization that even agreeing to see him here had gone too far. "How is Thomas doing?" Taking a sip of his drink, Harold inquired nonchalantly. I hurriedly answered, "He's good," attempting to maintain the status quo. "Just busy." Harold nodded while maintaining eye contact with me. The act of faking was over. Now, more than ever, the tension between us was evident. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. His words seemed to pull me further under his spell. He had a captivating charisma. "You know," Harold began saying, leaning in slightly, "Thomas is a great guy, but sometimes I wonder whether he truly sees you for who you are. I mean, look at you. You're amazing. You deserve so much more than what you have." My heart pounded in my chest. His words struck a chord, and I despised how good it felt to hear them. I opened my mouth to reply, but I was at a loss for words. Was he correct? Was I just settling? Was Thomas truly my soulmate? These questions stirred my mind, but I didn't have time to answer them. At that moment, the only thing that mattered was the thick, suffocating tension between us. Harold's hand brushed against mine as he reached across the table. It was a fleeting touch, but I felt every bit of it, and in that instant, I realized how dangerously close I was to crossing a boundary I never thought I'd approach. My hand didn't withdraw. Rather, I let it linger a moment longer than I should have. The waiter arrived, breaking the tension, but when Harold and I exchanged glances, it was clear we were both wondering the same thing. What if we didn't hold back? The moment the waiter left, time seemed to stand still. The air between us felt electric, as if an unseen force was drawing us together. For the first time in what felt like ages, my thoughts weren't consumed by Thomas or the question of right and wrong. It was just me and Harold, and the intensity of that moment was utterly overwhelming. Initially, Harold stayed silent. He didn't need words. His eyes said it all. They were deep and intense, holding a question that didn't need to be spoken. I could feel his gaze on me, searing into my very being, and for a brief moment, it was like I'd forgotten who I was. "Are you sure about this?" he asked eventually, his voice soft, almost a whisper. He wasn't just talking about having lunch. He was questioning everything that had brought us to this point. I had no idea how to respond. A part of me wanted to shout, "No!" to get up and leave, to run far away from him and the mess this was becoming. But another part, the part of me that was worn down and exhausted, was ready to surrender, ready to let everything go. With his palm still hanging close to me, Harold said, "You have no idea how much I've wanted this." His wraitho mask were a confession rather than an allegation. He made no effort to conceal the truth. He wanted me, and it was about everything he had been suppressing for years, not just the present. If I could have stopped this, I would have said anything. I should have told myself that I had a husband and family that trusted me, but I was unable to do so. I was unable to say anything. Harold's eyes made me feel alive, wanted, and desired, and that was all I could think about. I spoke in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. I don't know if I can do this. Though they were the truth, the words seemed like they were suffocating me. I wasn't sure if I could stop myself, but I also wasn't sure if I could follow through. You don't need to do anything, Harold said in a quiet, almost comforting manner. All I want is for you to be truthful with yourself. Do you also sense it? I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell him I didn't feel anything, that I wasn't interested in him that way. But I couldn't lie. I felt it all, the tension, the longing. It was undeniable. For a brief moment, my thoughts drifted to Thomas. I reflected on how deeply I cared for him, and how I could never bear to hurt him. But the more I dwelled on it, the more I realized I hadn't felt this way in years. Perhaps I was deceiving myself, or perhaps I was simply exhausted from pretending everything was perfect. I lowered my gaze to my hands, unable to meet Harold's eyes. This wasn't just about him. It was about me. I was the one who had let things escalate to this point. I was the one who had responded to his touch. I was the one who felt this undeniable pull toward him. And now, there was no going back. Before I could say anything, a familiar voice called out behind me. There you are. It was Thomas. My heart froze. I turned to see him standing in the doorway of the cafe, his face lighting up when his eyes met mine. I felt exposed, as though I'd been caught in the act. His sudden arrival hit me like a jolt of icy water. My pulse quickened, and I felt the color drain from my face. Harold immediately withdrew his hand, leaning back in his chair as if nothing had happened. Thomas waved at us, and I forced a smile, though it felt like my entire world had just come crashing down. Hey, sweetie, Thomas said as he approached the table. His gaze shifted between me and Harold, lingering on Harold just a little longer than usual. How's everything going? Harold flashed him a grin, as if he hadn't been on the verge of crossing a dangerous line with me moments ago. Good, man. Just catching up with your wife. I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say? How could I describe the tension that had nearly led to something irreversible? Thomas sat down with a casual smile, completely oblivious to the storm that had just passed between me and Harold. His sudden arrival felt like a jolt, a sharp reminder that I couldn't escape the reality of the situation. I didn't know how to act, how to meet Harold's eyes without revealing the turmoil inside me. But I had no choice. I had to keep it together. I had to pretend everything was normal. Oh, hey babe, I said, forcing a smile and trying to sound natural. My voice felt foreign, unfamiliar, as it escaped my lips. I didn't think you'd be back this quickly. Tomas's gaze met mine, warm and familiar. You know me, always on the move. Thought I'd surprise you for lunch. His eyes shifted to Harold, who was trying too hard to appear nonchalant, as if he hadn't been holding my hand just moments ago. Looks like you two are having a nice chat. Everything okay? I nodded quickly, not trusting my voice. Yeah, just catching up. Old friends, I replied, forcing the words out like they didn't leave a sour taste. Sensing the tension, Harold gave a slight nod. Yeah, just talking about the good old days. Good to see you, man. He stood abruptly, almost as if he couldn't get away fast enough. Thomas nodded back at him with a polite smile. See you around, Harold. Take care. And Harold walked away. My thoughts raced. How had it come to this? How had I allowed things to spiral so far out of control? I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at everything I had built. Thomas was completely oblivious, but I was in contrast. I knew exactly what was at stake, and I loathed myself for it. I turned to Thomas as soon as Harold was out of sight, guilt squeezing in my chest. I opened my mouth to say, "Thomas," but my words fell flat. What should I have said? How could I justify nearly betraying him? I had been about to do something I would never be able to undo, but how could I tell him? Thomas pretended that everything was okay when he picked up the menu. "What would you want to order then? I'm going hungry." It seemed as though he was completely unaware of the tension, or perhaps he was aware of it but chose to ignore it, and that was more painful for me than anything else. I inhaled deeply. "I'm not starving." His face clouded with concern as he studied me. "Hey, are you okay? You've been acting strange since I got here. Is something bothering you?" That was the moment I realized how much I had been deceiving myself. Thomas knew me better than anyone else. He could sense when something was off, even if I didn't say a word. He saw through my silence, through the lies I hadn't even spoken, but I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't confess what I had almost done. At least not now. Not like this. Forcing a weak smile, I shoved everything back into the depths where it belonged. "I'm fine, just tired. Maybe we can head home after this." Thomas seemed to accept it. "Okay, we'll leave after lunch. But you know you can talk to me if something's on your mind, right?" I nodded, though inside I was screaming. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. Thomas and I returned home, and I continued pretending, acting as though everything was fine. But inside my thoughts were spinning. What was I supposed to do? The connection with Harold hadn't vanished, quietly simmering, waiting for the perfect opportunity to burst forth at any moment. That night as we lay in bed, Thomas drew me in close, just as he always did. But something was different. I didn't feel the warmth I normally experienced. I had the impression that I was lying beside an unknown person. How could I still see him the same way after everything that almost occurred? How could I act as though I hadn't nearly surpassed the boundary? In the hopes that the darkness would cover up my eyes of shame, I turned my back on him. The silence between us was heavy, not just physically, but emotionally. I knew I couldn't continue like this indefinitely. I would eventually have to face the consequences of my actions. Whether I was prepared or not, I would have to confront the reality. Thomas must have sensed the change in my demeanor because he leaned closer and whispered into the darkness. "What's going on with you? You're not acting like yourself." I closed my eyes tightly, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a weak smile. "I'm just tired." But the truth was far more complicated. I wasn't merely tired. I felt utterly broken, and I had no idea how to begin to fix what was wrong inside me. As the days went by, I decided to maintain the facade that everything was perfectly fine, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I began to avoid Harold completely, ignoring his messages and not returning his calls. However, the more I tried to distance myself from him, the more I came to the painful realization that I was trapped in a situation I couldn't escape. Then, one evening, I received a chilling message that sent a shiver down my spine. "I know what happened, and I'm not going to let you forget it." It was from Harold, and those words echoed ominously in my mind, intensifying my sense of dread. That's the wrap-up of today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you found our content engaging, a thumbs up and sharing it with your loved ones would be much appreciated. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, Love 30K Stories, and turn on the notification bell for updates on our latest videos. Your support is everything to us. Until next time, take care and goodbye.